2019. And the committee was directed to review the flood damage caused by 2019 flooding events, particularly the relationship between local, state, tribal, and federal entities regarding flood control, the role of state government in flood control, and the availability of resources. So generally how the one-day committee went, the committee received testimony from state and federal agencies on the impact of 2019 flooding and the responsibilities of each agency when it comes to flooding. The page you're looking at now has the committee's final recommendations, but they are also at the bottom of the document. So I'm just going to skip this page for now, but we'll review those at the very end. So first on the agenda was reviewing the actual flooding itself. A meteorologist described the strong storm systems early in the year that saturated the ground. Significant rainfall in March and May, combined with the melting snowpack, created major flooding as rainwater created runoff that could not soak into the ground. After the meteorologist described the conditions that led to the flooding, the Adjutant General described how the State Emergency Operations Center, or SEOC, was activated. It was activated for 65 days during this spring flooding of 2019. Probably most important to recognize from his presentation was he noted where improvements needed to be made in the State Emergency Operations Center, including increasing space and technology. The Adjutant General also emphasized the importance of mapping programs so that we can predict where water will flow in the event of a flood. And he also emphasized the need for more river gauges, so to measure the amount of water that's flowing. So after the flood itself was reviewed, state agencies presented, and mostly on their role in when a flood occurs. So first was the Department of Agriculture, Division of Water Resources. The Division of Water Resources discussed the Department of Agriculture's use of flood risk maps using elevation data and the utilization of community access grants to contact communities and inform them of areas at risk of flooding. So again, it's kind of a theme that came up quite a bit, the idea of flood maps and prediction models and how important those are in the event of a flood. Next was KDHE's Bureau of Water. He focused on the impact of flooding on wastewater facilities, including increased risk of sewage contamination and debris in the water. He also discussed how several communities issued boil water advisories as a result of line breaks, pressure loss, and then he recommended that communities improve their infrastructure investment so that to better create a contingency plan in the future. So improvement in infrastructure. Next came the Kansas Water Office. The Water Office described their statutory responsibility to collect and compile information and to plan. But he also noted that flooding is generally not in the Water Office's purview or a major responsibility of the Water Office. The Water Office also outlined requests or recommendations from the state agencies to improve response flooding. So you can see those listed on the right-hand side. So including stream gauging network enhancements, so similar to what the Adjutant General mentioned, increasing the number of gauges to measure the amount of water that's flowing. SEOC, you'll remember, stands for State Emergency Operations Center. So again, similar to the Adjutant General, in improving the State Emergency Operations Center. An agency recommendation also included geographic information system enhancements. So again, related to flood mapping. The agencies also recommended a basin to basins evaluation and a plan that costs approximately $200 per basin. And finally, public water supply emergency planning, including alternative water sources and contingencies. So in the case of a water supply being contaminated, having an alternate source for drinking water for the community. The next agency was the Department of Wildlife, Parks, and Tourism. First, the Law Enforcement Division described how they conduct search and rescues and welfare checks in the event of flooding. The State Parks Division generally just described the effects that flooding had on the state parks, including damage to parks and also the decrease in visitors during 2019 due to the amount of flooding. The afternoon of the committee heard from federal agencies and their responsibilities during a flood event. The first was the Natural Resources Conservation Service through the U.S. Department of Agriculture. She described several programs that assist private individuals with flood damage. So one of the ones she described is the Kansas Disaster Flood Recovery Initiative, which provides assistance to agriculture producers to plant cover crops. And during the spring 2019 flooding, she estimated that Kansas farmers received about $1 million through that program. On the right-hand side of the screen, she also described the Emergency Watershed Protection Program. This program removes hazards and restores streams back to pre-disaster conditions. So if something is blocking water flow, this program assists in removing whatever that object is, trees, etc. The next federal agency to testify was the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, first from the Tulsa district. For those that are unfamiliar, to put it simply, Kansas is divided between two Army Corps of Engineer districts. Essentially the northern half of the state falls under the Kansas City district, and we'll discuss what they testified to. And the southern half of the state falls under the Tulsa district. So that's why you'll see Tulsa district and Kansas City district from the Army Corps of Engineers. So the Tulsa district described how the release of water from reservoirs is based on the principle of water on the ground. So how much water has actually fallen rather than the predicted rainfall. Three different representatives presented from the Kansas City district of the Army Corps of Engineers. The first one described how there are three phases used to decide when to release water from a reservoir. And the three phases you can generally see described on the left-hand side, but basically it's based on how much storage space is taken up in the reservoir. The more storage taken up, the next phase that reservoir falls into. On the right-hand side of the screen, the Army Corps of Engineers also stated that the reservoirs operated as designed during the May 2019 flooding events, in that they held water until it could be released. Then the Army Corps of Engineers got into describing how more precisely what their role is during a flooding event. They described how they provide two types of assistance. First is technical assistance, so sending people to provide aid, and then direct assistance, which is providing equipment or machinery. Another conferee, still from the Army Corps of Engineers, described how there are three phases for response and recovery to floods in which the Army Corps of Engineers is involved. So phase one is initial response, phase two is recovery, and phase three is long-term planning for future actions. Finally, the Army Corps of Engineers described a couple of studies that are occurring in various districts. The Omaha district is conducting a study to evaluate past flooding and to make recommendations for possibly adopting new flow frequency estimates. Another study is being done in the Kansas River Basin to plan for flood risks, to study the impact of sediment in lakes, and to improve lake sustainability and storage protection. So as I mentioned earlier, the committee made recommendations at the end of the day, and we'll walk through each of those. The first recommendation, which you'll remember, was also under the agency recommendation. The committee recommends that the Kansas Water Office conduct a basin-by-basin evaluation of Kansas reservoirs to determine where flooding is occurring and possible actions that can be taken to prevent flooding events. The second recommendation is that the House Committee on Appropriations and the Senate Committee on Ways and Means consider a plan to restore the $8 million statutory transfer to the State Water Plan Fund. For any that are unfamiliar, in statute, there is a $6 million transfer from the State General Fund to the State Water Plan Fund and a $2 million transfer from the Economic Development Initiatives Fund per year to the State Water Plan Fund. So that's where the $8 million comes from: $6 million State General Fund, $2 million Economic Development Initiatives Fund. That full transfer has not been made since 2008. It's typically adjusted during the budget process. The third recommendation is that the state water plan include efforts to combat the buildup of sedimentation, and also that the Kansas Water Office provide information to the two agriculture committees regarding sedimentation, including the estimated timeline for clearing sedimentation to increase reservoir capacity. The next recommendation, the Kansas Water Office the committee requested from the Kansas Water Office information on Iowa's system for reporting flooding events and providing resources to affected citizens and landowners. And finally, the committee requested that the Kansas Department of Wildlife, Parks, and Tourism provide information to the two committees on agriculture and natural resources regarding damage to state property and infrastructure due to the 2019 flooding events. And it's not part of the committee report, but I did want to share what the Kansas Water Office provided to the two agriculture and natural resources committees. So in March of 2020, the Water Office provided the requested information on sedimentation and the Iowa system. So first on sedimentation, they described in 2016, 3 million cubic yards of sediment was dredged from the John Redmond Reservoir. That took 5 months and $20 million. To remove all sediment from all 24 reservoirs would cost $6.5 billion and take 3 dredges about 50 years. And sustaining this once The 6.5 billion was spent. Sustaining this would cost them 130 million per year. The Water Office also discussed alternative methods to dredging to remove sediment, including water injection dredging. They note that it is cheaper, but water injection dredging is more untested than typical dredging. And a pilot has been proposed at Tuttle Creek Lake to test water injection dredging. The Water Office also provided information on Iowa's system for flood management. The Water Office noted their Iowa's use of stream gauges and flood modeling. So as I mentioned, it is a theme between the Adjutant General and other agency requests for stream gauges and flood modeling. The Water Office also noticed how Iowa's flood center's work is available on a single web platform. Kansas's tends to be spread between several agencies or even federal agencies, so it's difficult to find information in one place. So they know the Water Office noted several, after examining Iowa, they noted several gaps in Kansas that could be improved, including, again, the gauge network, so increasing the number of gauges, improving flood modeling, and creating a central reporting process for flood statistics so that all that information is in one place. During that testimony, the Water Office also noted that they are beginning the basin by basin evaluation that was also requested as part of the committee's recommendations. And Mr. Chairman, I will stand for any questions if there are any.
Be some, I hope. But let me ask this: are the testimonies that were given during that special committee, are those available somewhere?
Yes. Yeah, I can provide those to Damien, and he can add them to the committee page if you'd like.
Thank you for that. And then also the information that the Water Office provided to the Ag Committee, their report on both sedimentation and the Iowa systems and all that, also give that to Damien?
Yes, I will.
Okay, let's open it up for questions then. I'm looking over at the screen. Hands up or speak up, one of the two. Representative Riley.
Thank you, Chairman. Is my mic working today?
Is the light on?
It was not working. Yeah, it's on, but it wasn't working the other day. So. Are you
we can.
All right. Can you hear me all right?
It is working.
All right. So my question is, when those studies were done on that sediment removal and dredging, what, particularly with the one dredging that's already been done, where did that sediment go after that was dredged out? What was the end result of that? And then also, environmentally, did we see some any fish kill, any things that happened during that period of time too? Because you're disrupting that whole bottom layer of feeding that would happen for different kinds of fish, catfish, different kind of fish. So that's my question. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Sure, if I'm hearing your question correctly, first you asked where did the sediment go after it was removed from John Redmond? And the answer is it's placed in disposal facilities near the site. So essentially land is designated to be where they put the sediment, and then it sits there, to put it very simply. And the second question was any fish or wildlife affected by the dredging or by the flooding?
By the dredging?
By the dredging? I'm not sure, but I will look into that and get back to you.
I have three in line for questions, so we'll begin with Representative Newman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I apologize there. Victoria, when you said that the $8 million that was reported and all that, it hasn't been utilized, but maybe in a different way. Could you explain that to me again, please?
Sure. So in statute, as I mentioned, there's supposed to be a transfer from the state general fund to the state water plan fund for $6 million. So every year, the state general fund is supposed to transfer to the state water plan fund $6 million. And the same thing from the Economic Development Initiative Fund to the state water plan fund for $2 million. So every year, there's supposed to be a total of $8 million going into the state water plan fund. But those transfers have been reduced during the budget process since 2008. So, for instance, most recently, the transfer from the state general fund to the state water plan fund was about $4 million. And typically, the transfer from the Economic Development Initiatives Fund to the state water plan fund is about $500,000. Although last year it was $900,000. But anyway, so it's not the full transfer that is in statute. Is that any better?
Yes, thank you. That's what I thought, but I couldn't remember the exact numbers of what the transfers were. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Next on the list, Representative Stodgel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess this is kind of piggybacking on Representative Riley's question, but I was just wondering, not being real familiar with dredging, I'm just wondering if the injection dredging actually removes silt, or does it just move it downstream?
Yes, so it moves it downstream. So I'm sorry for any of the agency that's listening. I'm not a scientist, but essentially what it does is injects high pressure water into the bottom of the reservoir, which loosens the sediment at the bottom, and it then flows downstream. Basically, very basically.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Good question. We asked that one during the process. Representative Bishop.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me adequately?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. I have a question regarding the resolution in the list of recommendations. A resolution about contacting or sending it to the congressional delegation. And my question is, has that been done? If not, then perhaps we want to do that, but there might be a little bit of work to bring it up to date, because perhaps some of that has been done at the federal level. And so that would be my next question. Do we know whether a study has been instituted, or the appropriations for the 2019 flood damage has been accomplished?
Representative, as for the appropriations, as far as I'm aware, there has not been a federal appropriation. As for the study, I'm not sure whether a study has begun by the Army Corps of Engineers, but I will check on that and get back to you. But the appropriation, as far as I'm aware, not at the federal level, no.
And I'm not sure on the resolution whether one was ever formulated or not. I'd have to check on that. Or Victoria, do you know?
I don't believe so.
Okay.
That might be something we could put on our to-do list. I would like to just add that I believe when sediment or dredging takes place, the result is frequently is what we refer to as anaerobic, and it takes a while for that to reconstitute itself. In other words, there's no oxygen left in it, and it is not necessarily good soil. It doesn't make for a good soil for a while. So it has to be placed somewhere where it can gradually be reconstituted.
That's a fact. The John Redmond, all that dredging was placed in low areas around there, and it's still sitting there, and someday it may come back to life. But for now, it's just sitting there. And for the high pressure injection, it becomes slurry and goes through the gates and down the river. And so there is a test project. I don't know if the project has started. We need to find out the answer to that question. But there is money was allocated for the test on the Tuttle Creek Dam to try a small injection to see how it works. And we'll know more when that test study is done. But I'll ask the research to check with the Army Corps, whoever, to see if that study has begun. Thank you, Representative Bishop. Next on the list is Representative Murphy. Representative Murphy, did you decide not to ask your question? Moving on, Representative Jennings.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With respect to the last bullet point of recommendations, Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks providing information to both Senate and House Agriculture Committees regarding damage, do we know whether or not that report was made?
Mr. Chairman, if I could answer the question. Yes, Wildlife Parks and Tourism provided testimony to both Agriculture and Natural Resources Committees during the 2020 session. But more recently, they also provided similar testimony to Legislative Budget Committee in October of 2020, excuse me. So they have provided a couple of updates on the state of flooding damage in their state parks.
Thanks for that. I'd ask maybe, Mr. Chairman, that we be provided a copy of that. I'm also interested in knowing how they handled their lost revenue. They had a significant loss of revenue during 2019, and I'm curious about how they absorbed that within their operations, what they maybe didn't do or put off doing in order to do that. And just one additional item, I'd ask that we submit an inquiry to Wildlife and Parks. It gives us a detail of whether or not they received any FEMA or other federal assistance in rehabilitating state park areas that were damaged as a result of flooding. Thank you.
That is included in the report they gave the Ag committees, but as far as requesting and receiving any FEMA funds, I do not know. So we'll need to ask them that question and research. Victoria, will you take care of that? Thank you. Next we have.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Could I comment on that? Would that be okay?
Absolutely, please.
Sure. So I don't know if this is what you have in mind for your operations question, but last year the Wildlife Parks and Tourism did receive $2 million in state general fund to help with park repairs. It will not cover all of the money, but so to help offset some of the lost revenue, they did receive $2 million in state general fund to put toward parks repairs. I don't know if that's what you were thinking with the operations question. And then in answer to the FEMA question, I can say that in their October testimony, Wildlife Parks and Tourism noted that they have not received any FEMA funds as of yet. FEMA had not even visited the park sites, that they had spoken to Wildlife Parks and Tourism over the phone extensively. So as of October, no, there have not been any FEMA funds given to Wildlife Parks and Tourism as a result of the flooding. But I will check to make sure that nothing has changed on that end.
Yeah, I think you pretty much nailed it there. I guess my concern is Wildlife and Parks is largely a fee-funded agency through users and permits and visitors, and it's a significant loss for them that is hard to absorb. And I wonder what the price we pay in infrastructure and services is as a result of that. But I appreciate the information.
There'll be good information, and we'll ask him for an update, Representative Jennings. And if I recall correctly, they said that 2020 was one of their best years. So we'll follow up and get all that information. With the COVID thing, everybody was going to the parks, and so it was well used, and they made quite a bit of money last year. So with that, moving on, Representative Vaughn.
Mr. Chair, I have 2 questions, if that's okay.
You bet.
Awesome. Okay, so the first one, I was just curious who's currently directing the use of the state water plan funds. Is that the Kansas Water Authority, or is that divided among agencies?
Sure, Mr. Chairman. Yes, the Kansas Water Authority makes the official recommendations on the allocations to the State Water Plan Fund. Yes, they consult with agencies, but the Water Authority makes the official recommendations.
And then my second question for the implementation, an estimate for total cost and time to remove all sedimentation. I was wondering if we had a similar prediction for the basin by basin analysis to analyze all 24. It said KWO had started on that, but I was curious how long that will take and if they need additional resources.
Sure. I can say that during the special committee, they estimated each basin at $200,000. Once they've started, I don't know if that has changed or whether it's increased or decreased once they've actually started the study. But I will check with them and get back to you.
Great. Thank you.
These are great questions, and when we call the agencies in, you'll be ready to ask them all kinds of questions. So with that, Representative Riley, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Don't want to distract from the current train of thought, but my question had to do with some of that was previously in her discussion, having to do with, it seems like some of the large chemical companies were paying some kind of a fee per each gallon of product that they were selling. And that was to offset, I don't know whether the EPA was getting that money or who was getting that money, whether it was coming to the state, or to offset for runoff and costs of fertilizer and different pesticides that were possibly being run off. And so there was some kind of a fee that was set. Did that ever come up? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
That was within the Ag Committee, and that's under the purview of the Ag Department. They have this fund you're talking about. It's coordinated with the KDHE, and it's for cleanup. And so they pay so much on each unit they sell to put into that fund. Not necessarily, well, no, hopefully it never gets that far. Whenever there's a spill, they go out and take care of it immediately, so it never gets that far. But something that we'll ask about, but we may have to defer to the Department of Agriculture on that one. That's a different, but it's a possible pollutant to our system. You're right. Representative Orr.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Victoria, I appreciate your comments this morning. You do a great job. One of the things you were talking about was the Corps of Engineers. And you talked about the 3 phases they went through. I think you said they assessed the problem, they did the recovery, and then the long-term planning. I am curious about how they intend to fund any of this with after their long-term planning. I mean, is it just planned, and then that we hope we fund it, or is there some mechanism involved there? And you may not know the answer to that.
Representative, I'm not sure of the answer. When it comes to who carries the cost of implementing a mitigation plan, so to speak. The Army Corps of Engineers did comment on who pays when there is damage. So if it's a federal levy, then the Army Corps of Engineers at the federal level foots the entire bill, so they pay 100% to fix the levy if it's a federal levy. If it's a non-federal levy, then it's an 80-20 split. 80% is covered by federal funds and 20% at the local cost. But again, that's if damage has already occurred. What it takes to implement an action plan, I'm not sure.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And therein lies the impetus for the creation of this committee, to try to determine what's going on and the funding of everything. And part of the purpose of this report today was to show you what happened when there was a problem and all the agencies involved, and there was some finger pointing and all of that going on. So we want to try to get to the bottom of this, and that's what this committee will do. And I'm excited that everybody's interested and has lots of questions, so it's going to be fun. Representative Stodgill, do you have another question?
No, not at this time, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Okay, I just saw your hand raised. So any other questions? Yes, I see one from Representative Minix, please.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question about things between our states. The sedimentation in Tuttle Creek Reservoir obviously comes mainly from Nebraska. And how do our adjacent states treat their upstream mitigation of sedimentation that affects our state? And which department or agency would be responsible for that?
Mr. Chairman, I'm just gonna have to say that would be a great question for one of the agencies, probably the Water Office, because they have the most general knowledge. Because I do not know how we coordinate between states on sediment. But yes, I'm sorry that I do not know.
That's an excellent question, and there are lawsuits involving not on sediment at this point, but on other things between us, Colorado, and I'm not sure about the Nebraska if it's been solved or not. But we will discuss all those, and that'll be a great topic for another day. Anything further, Representative? Okay, committee, I see no further hands raised. Do you have any more questions? Silence. Right now, tomorrow is kind of up in the air. I think we'll have our committee meeting, but I'm not absolutely positive yet because there are calls that we may be on the floor. I will know more and we'll let you know by email, so keep track of your emails today whether we have to cancel tomorrow or not. If you don't hear anything, we will have our meeting. But until then, and we have the current acting director of the Water Office coming in, so to give us an overview of the vision plan. This is not the time to jump into all these other questions, but we just want to hear what the vision plan that is in place to see if it's still viable or what. So we'll look at that tomorrow. Anything else for the good of the committee? And hopefully tomorrow, if we do meet, we will do our AV training, our audio visual, so that everybody gets a good feel for how this stuff works. And then some simple things, how to go out to the legislative website and get all this information, share it with your constituents, that type of thing. So with that, if there's nothing further, we are adjourned.